Welcome to a virtual tour of Eureka Lake Park's plant assemblages and wildlife habitats. Here, we see a high bluff along Walnut Creek which serves as a boundary between two major habitat types in the park. Upland forests, in areas that never flood, and lowland forests, where frequent flooding has a profound impact on the tree species that can grow, and correspondingly, animal species that inhabit the forest. The low-lying area regularly flooded by Walnut Creek is called a floodplain, and it's occupied by a habitat called a lowland or bottomland forest. Rich soil deposits in the floodplain mean that bottomland forest trees and other plants are not limited by water or nutrient availability. By modifying the forest habitat, that is, destroying canopy trees, the creek also provides sunlight to other plants in the bottomland forest ecosystem. Trees, such as the silver maple, that are pulled into the creek by erosion, will provide habitat for aquatic wildlife. American beavers may also modify the structure of bottomland forests with their typical feeding activity shown here on a hackberry tree. With the constant threat of flooding disturbance, floodplain trees have adapted to live fast because they usually die young. This tall eastern cottonwood is probably only about 50 years old. This black walnut on a less flood-prone part of the site is probably much older. Note, however, the open, park-like quality of the woods here. The large amount of sunlight that penetrates the forest floor is very important for wildlife. High levels of sunlight promote a rich growth of herbaceous, shrub, and vine vegetation, much of which consists of native species, and provides food and shelter for numerous bird and mammal species. White-tailed deer like to browse and walk in bottomland forests, feeding on species such as cutleaf coneflower, shown here, and wood nettle, shown here. Dead trees that remain standing in the bottomland forest provide important snag habitat for woodpeckers. Silver maple, one of the dominant species of the floodplain forest, often develops cavities while still alive. Honey locust, shown here, is another dominant canopy species. Honey locust's famous thorns, shown here, indicate it may have co-evolved with large browsing animals such as mastodons. Hawthorn also sports fearsome thorns, but unlike the honey locust, produces fruit that's widely eaten by birds. In summary, bottomland forests are complex, structurally diverse habitats that support a large range of plant and animal species. Some birds typically associated with bottomland forests include red-bellied woodpeckers and barred owls. Both of these species utilize the large numbers of dead trees and snags that are typically found in bottomland forests. Let's move to the upland forest. Eureka Lake Park actually contains a couple of different upland forest types. Upland forest types are typically classified by soil conditions and the tree species that dominate the canopy. In Eureka Lake Park, we have some areas of what's considered a mesic, or medium moisture upland forest, dominated largely by sugar maple, as well as what could be called a dry mesic, or moderately dry forest, dominated by oak and hickory species. This is an example of a mesic forest in Eureka Lake Park. It's dominated by sugar maple. Notice there aren't a lot of shrubs in the understory, just young sugar maple trees. This is because sugar maple is very shade tolerant, and once it dominates the forest, it tends to dominate it for a very long time. Sugar maples of all ages and sizes create a layered canopy that provides habitat for many smaller bird species. Because of the deep shade cast by sugar maple canopies in the summer, many understory plants have adapted to complete their life cycle before sugar maple leafs out in the spring. These species, called spring ephemerals, are an important food source for early insects. Unlike most bottomland tree species, sugar maple can be quite long-lived, living more than 200 years. As sugar maples age, they develop broken branches that can provide habitat for cavity nesting, birds, and mammals. Broken and decaying trees also contain wood-eating insects that are an important food source for wildlife. Furthermore, the collapse of large canopy trees in the mesic forest can create large canopy gaps that allow more sunlight to reach the forest floor. This can create hotspots of plant and animal diversity within the forest. Here we see young sugar maple trees filling in a sizable canopy gap. Many animal species, including ground foraging birds, salamanders, and others, utilize decaying fallen trees on the forest floor. Wind throw and the loss of individual canopy trees is the main disturbance that affects mesic forests dominated by sugar maple. The other main upland forest ecosystem we'll discuss, the oak-hickory forest, was historically influenced by a disturbance that really doesn't happen anymore in central Illinois: fire. Fire occurred naturally and was also promoted by Native Americans because it made hunting and traveling easier without a large layer of vegetation on the ground to obstruct people or animals. In the absence of regular fire, most oak-hickory forests now contain large numbers of young oak and hickory trees, as shown here. But you typically don't have to look far to find one of the original members of the forest. Here is a large, open-grown bur oak, the most fire-tolerant species of oak. Here's a close-up of the thick bark of an oak, which historically protected them from grass and brush fires. In this section of the park, large white oaks dominate the canopy, but young sugar maples dominate the understory. Oaks have unique value as wildlife trees. Here you can see an ancient, open-grown white oak on the left, and a very large, open-grown shagbark hickory on the right. Both oaks and hickories are what foresters refer to as mast-producing trees. This means they produce a crop of large, edible seeds each fall. These seeds are a crucial food source for animals like squirrels, as well as game species like wild turkeys and deer. Oaks, when they're leafed out, also host large numbers of insect larvae, which are an important food source for insect-feeding birds such as warblers, vireos, and thrushes. Black walnut is another mass-producing species sometimes found in oak-hickory forests. Wildlife in upland forests utilize resources other than mast at different times of year. Here, a fox squirrel eats bark and young buds off of a large hackberry tree in a oak-hickory to sugar maple forest transition. Historically, many oak-dominated forests would have had wide spacing between canopy trees, leaving large amounts of sunlight to pass through the canopy and promote the growth of grass and other plants in the ground layer. Here we see an area that hasn't completely filled in and still promotes a shrub thicket with young trees around it. Some bird species utilize this area very heavily during migratory and breeding season. Crucially, enough sunlight exists here to promote not only growth of raspberries, but a grassy ground layer, which is crucial for some animal species. Songbirds and small mammals such as bulls and rabbits are all likely to utilize this thicket of native elderberry shrubs. But in the midst of the thicket, young walnut and hickory shoots hint at the ongoing process of succession. This area maintains some of its oak savanna-like quality because mowing prevents a transition to a closed canopy forest. However, some savanna specialist species like red-headed woodpeckers may utilize areas like this. Finally, let's talk about some more human-modified habitats that are nonetheless important to consider for wildlife. Edge habitats like this contain lots of sunlight, lots of shrubs, and are really attractive to mesocarnivores like raccoons and coyotes, and extremely unattractive to species like forest interior birds. In this type of habitat, our native shrubs are often outcompeted by Asian bush honeysuckle, which has a lower wildlife value than native shrubs, and native tree canopies can be damaged by invasive vines like this oriental bittersweet, which can grow quite large and strangle canopy trees. You'll notice that a lot of the understory of this forest is honeysuckle. While this benefits some bird species, all in all, it has less wildlife value than a native shrub community. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention an artificial type of habitat called a hedgerow, which is typically a row of trees growing along a fence separating two agricultural fields. Remarkably, hedgerows have served as a surrogate for many bird and animal species for savanna habitats that have largely been lost with the conversion to agriculture and a loss of prescribed burning. Now that more hedgerows are being destroyed to make crop growing more efficient, the population of many of these grassland and savanna birds, such as red-headed woodpeckers and meadowlarks, has plummeted anywhere 50 to 80% across their range in the central U.S. Grasslands were historically one of the most large and important ecosystems in Illinois, especially on uplands, but today there aren't many left, and Eureka Lake Park is no exception. This grassland within the park is completely composed of cool season, non-native grasses that were probably planted here as lawns or pasture and left to their own devices. Nevertheless, this degraded grassland habitat provides a lot of the same services to wildlife as a native grassland, although it most likely supports generalist species like red-tailed hawks, meadow voles, and red foxes rather than true co-evolved prairie specialists. Well, that concludes our short virtual tour of ecosystems of Eureka Lake Park. Go check out the park yourself, and I hope I've inspired you to ask some questions about life in the park.